O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we will be discussing World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, so to speak, as it was called. Started in 1914, ended in 1918. Officially, the peace treaty was signed in 1919, but the war ended in 1918. It was the first mechanized war, the first truly global war involving every major continent in the world, plus almost all of the most powerful nations of the world. In this war, the dream that many people had of a humanistic utopia was shattered due to the unsurpassed loss of life, livelihood, and property. There were several million soldiers killed, as well as several million civilians killed. Leading up to this point, we see Europe had become increasingly secularized, humanistic. Darwinism, evolutionism, was very popular in the early 1900s. In fact, let's discuss briefly about the early 1900s, because this was kind of like either the direct outcome or the end of the Gilded Age. Maybe the Gilded Age is more specifically for the United States, but
yeah, I think when looking at Victorian England, that certainly had an aspect of the Gilded Age too, though.
Right, but certainly so. In the early 1900s, this was all the industrial technological advances that were made in the 1800s basically came to their tipping point, so to speak, in the early 1900s. You have like a slew of different inventions that are made in the early 1900s, such as the airplane. Electricity was a little bit before the turn of the century, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
I believe you have radio, the automobile, the Model T Ford,
Yeah.
1907 or something.
I forget which
something.
year for that.
It is early 1900s. The nations of Europe, and also not just Europe, but in Asia as well, you have empires basically reaching their zenith. You have the Ottoman Empire. It's at its height.
I would say that one's on the decline.
I guess you're right. Yeah, but then it's gonna take its death blow during World War I. But certainly Germany.
Yeah,
is
and I would say with
basically
Germany,
at its height of power.
So when we were looking at Victorian England in the 1800s, England was the premier superpower in the world.
Uh-huh.
By this point, Germany's caught up, and that's one of the big tensions, is that Britain's looking over at Germany. Germany's building a navy, and Britain's like, we're supposed to control the seas.
Right.
So Britain's very concerned about Germany, and Germany is aggressive.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah,
Well, at least not necessarily actively aggressive.
No.
At that point,
but
they were ambitious. Certainly.
Yeah, we'll go. Ambitious is a good word. And so you have this opposing superpower coming with technology just ramping up that is arguably surpassing Britain at this point. So that's a grave concern between two superpowers there.
But we have to remember, by 1914, remember the link between the leaders of the monarchs of Great Britain, Germany, and Russia. They were all cousins, right? They're all descendants of Victoria, right? Queen Victoria.
I'm not sure how far back you got to go, and I know it wasn't.
They were descendants of an English
queen. Actually, that was at the end of the war, when the Kaiser. There was a movement in Parliament to try to get the Kaiser hanged, and George V stepped in to be like, no, you don't want to do that, and they just kind of died off.
Yeah. So George V, who was he King of England?
Yes.
George V Then in Germany, Wilhelm II.
Yep.
And then in Russia, the Tsar Nicholas II, I believe.
Yep.
They were all cousins, so they were related to each other, but that didn't mean they didn't mind.
So it was all a
going to
big
war.
family fight.
Right. They were. Yeah. So it was a family lineage. So.
But we do see, and it varies per country. But as the militaries really get going, the power of the monarchs is much more limited.
Right.
Obviously in Britain it's already kind of this way. Even in Germany,
because you have the prime minister.
Yeah, the Kaiser was in charge, but then is basically just handed over to military operations.
Right.
And then Nicholas II, he was more in charge, and he actually took over military operations for a bit, and that didn't work out for him.
Okay. So actually, one of the notable things about the First World War is that you have this end of the monarchs.
Yeah.
Basically, end of monarchies. In this war, you have the end. You have these imperial so-called dynasties ended. I can't find where I wrote it down.
Yeah, you have so basically the Germans, which are like the Hohenzollerns, I mispronounced that. I'm sorry, but you have the Romanovs in Russia.
Right.
And you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire is just gone after this, so the Habsburgs are out, and the Ottoman Empire is also gone. So
right.
Just the reshaping of the European geopolitical map is
and also the Middle East.
Yes, and the Middle East.
Right. So it's basically the end of empires. World War One, the end of traditional empires, so to speak. Also, we have the creation of the Soviet Union there from the end of the war. So leading up to this point, see, we already discussed there's a great increase in military production of navies, huge warships with huge guns, huge cannons. You have the rise of just increase in the use of factories producing tons of resources, of weapons, of parts, of food.
Yeah.
And you have these technological advances like the airplane, like the automobile. You have electricity. Also, railroads are being constructed at this time in the early 1900s. So by the time of the Great War, the World War One, there was a huge network of railroads in Europe.
And you also have like the telegram. You have, like you said, with radio, that news can be spread very quickly. It's not like some of the wars we've covered in the past where it's going to take weeks before people know what happened, hundreds of miles away. Now they know the same day.
Right. And so just going to the traditional causes or springs of the war. First of all, this is from an article that I looked up from a pastor, no less. But defense alliances. So because these nations were getting so big, they felt threatened by other nations. Now, we have to also remember that there had not been a major European war since the Napoleonic Wars in the beginning of the 1800s. Right?
Yeah, I would agree with major. Important, though, here we have the Franco-Prussian Wars. Right. There's a lot of ill will held over that. Germany basically, Prussia, Germany, they took a couple territories on the edge of France and basically beat up France pretty quick in like the 1870s. Yeah, and so the French are still smarting from that and looking to get revenge. Meanwhile, the Germans are like, we can handle the French.
Right. Yeah. So you have that animosity, the hatred. But going back to the defense alliances, so because of these tensions. And I guess maybe we should discuss the Darwinism first. Because of the influence of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, you have the idea, obviously, of the survival of the fittest. Yeah. And this influenced the thinking of many of the leaders in Germany.
Yeah.
And in other European
I was going to
nations.
say, I think it goes further than that, and it even bleeds into nationalism
Right.
a lot, where every country, pretty much every single one of them are like, we have, our country is the greatest,
Right.
And to be French, to be British, to be German, I'm not sure what the Russians thought, but each of them thinks that their country, their nation, is the supreme nation, and of course we could win in a war because we're the best.
Right. Yeah. And contributing to that is the fact that not too long. It's not been too long since they just formed their nations, because it's only been a little more than 50 years in the 1830s to 50s. Around that time period, that's when all these revolutions broke out in Central Europe, and these nations were formed, like Germany out of all those little German states, and it's Italy out of those Italian states, and Austria-Hungary out of the, I guess, Austria and Hungary.
I mean, they had an empire for quite a while there.
Oh yeah, that's correct. It's mainly Germany, but that contributes to it as well. So they're thinking that they are superior in their own nations. That's nationalism. We already noted the militarism. Their militaries are built up. By this time, they have at least hundreds of thousands of troops, of standing armies.
Yeah, which in general, I'd say, just as far as industry, the amount of men, the amount of resources, just at this point, it's just dwarfing anything the world's ever seen before.
Right. I would also, because of the increased food supply, and also because of the lack of war, I'd say probably the populations had greatly increased since the 1800s as well.
Yeah, they're able to send armies of like 1 million into the field.
Right, and then replenish what their losses almost immediately
For a while.
Yeah, right. Then the defense alliances, because of these tensions between the European nations, they form defense alliances. So you have Germany and Austria-Hungary; they are together.
Yeah.
Right. I think mainly because of their German heritage.
Yeah, I think that was a big connection for them.
And then in southeastern Europe, you have this collection of smaller states that have not solidified into larger nations in the what region is it called? The Balkan region.
Yeah.
The Balkan Peninsula. You have nations like Serbia, Slavia. I don't know exactly.
So
what
I know
they are.
it was Serbia. So that's where basically where tensions boil over at first.
Yeah.
I believe they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a while.
Okay.
And they like managed to get like kind of an independence from them, but it was there was a lot of tension around that. They're like, yes, they were now Serbia, but they'd kind of broken away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austrians weren't super happy about that and were kind of hard on them, and so that's kind of where that comes from.
Gotcha. But the other alliances would be Russia and France.
Yeah,
they were linked together, and then there wasn't really a formal alliance between Britain and France. I don't think.
No, there wasn't.
Yeah,
it was
mainly for British interests that they helped France
and
in order to defend.
And I think the British, when the war actually came, because they weren't officially tied down to anything. Like when Russia went to war, France had to go to war because of their alliance. Britain was not required to. Right. But because of all the things they've been, they'd all been preparing for war for several years at this point. And when things get in motion, I think they find themselves kind of caught up into it and be like, oh, we were way further into this than we thought we were.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then we have the other major power, the Ottoman Empire. I'm skipping over Japan because by this time it's not really that much of a major power, but it will rise during and after the war. But the Ottoman Empire is on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary.
And they were neutral at the very beginning, and there was actually a big, and same for the United States, same for a couple of the countries in the like Bulgaria joined Germany partway through, where there was a big each side was trying to woo different neutral nations to join them because they're like, any more resources we can bring in would be great. And then the Ottomans eventually joined the German side.
Yep. Imperialism is another major part of why it goes along with their nationalism and the militarism. But so Germany
and their need for more resources.
Right. Germany, Great Britain, France, and obviously the United States, also Japan, and the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, they're basically empires. They have colonies all around the world, not just in their homelands. And so they want to expand. They want to maintain their imperial holdings, and so that contributes as well to their decisions to engage in warfare. And to go back to the significance of the war, I just want to point out some similarities between then and now. There are mass technological innovations. Right now, we're going through a major tech revolution. It's just continuing, especially with AI. There are networks of national alliances just as then, today, then and now. There are severe tensions right now, obviously, between world powers. We know the nations: North Korea, Russia, China, us, Great Britain, so on. There are smaller wars of imperial dominance and nationalist independence. But back then, there was a war going on in 1914 in the Balkan Peninsula, with these, especially with Serbia, because they wanted to have freedom from imperial dominance from Austria-Hungary, and also evolutionary humanism, just as then. Now that's pretty much widespread among people. Also, people back then were not prepared for a World War. They did not realize what they were getting into. Most
they were not prepared really, but it was a very popular war at first.
Right.
Most of the people wanted to go to war, wanted to prove that their nation, thought their nation would win because the nationalism, they thought they were the best.
Right. But they didn't understand what they were getting themselves into.
No, they didn't.
And I don't think people... Good
lesson there about counting the cost beforehand.
Right. I don't think right now that people would, their attention and people saying that there could very well be World War at any moment, and I don't think people are ready for World War in the Western world, at least. Evangelical churches, by this time, there had been a rise in liberalism and the social gospel in churches, and that really was a big influence in Europe, in the Western society. Just like now, we have a compromised condition in the evangelical churches, and then communism was on the rise. Right now, there are a lot of communists, I think, especially in the U.S. But to get back to how the war started, so we'll start with the timeline. Just go through the major events of the war, starting in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. I think it was just basically a ceremonial position, right?
He was the heir. Power? He was the heir.
Okay, he was the heir. He wasn't yet on the throne.
No, he wasn't on the throne, but this was, I forget which people groups this went for, but he was very popular, and some of the people groups that were not the ones in charge liked him a lot. And so this caused a lot of division because the next person was much more just like, no, like the Austrians are the ones and everybody else gets treated like garbage. And so that caused a lot of problems just among those different people groups, besides obviously just the whole alliance thing taking him down.
Was he Hungarian or was he...
I think he was Austrian. I think he was Austrian, but the Hungarians liked him.
Oh, okay. He was a Slavophile, whatever that means.
Means he loves the Slavs.
He favored a federation that would replace the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But on June 28th, 1914, he visits the major city of Sarajevo, however you pronounce that, in Serbia. It's actually a show of power, right? He goes there to say I'm the ruler, and you should You should respect me. But there are Serbs. There's a Serbian nationalist party called the Black Hand that they're fighting for independence, and they want to actually a guy like I think he's like 19 years old.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And he shoots the Archduke with his wife in their car while they're traveling, and so Serbia basically is unofficially declared war against.
Well, actually, so Austria-Hungary viewed this as a war act from Serbia towards them,
right?
And they sent a whole list of demands that are like outrageous to Serbia, and Serbia looks at it and is like, "Well, what can we do? We accept them." And Austria is like, we can't believe they accepted them because they wanted to go to war with them. So they sent another list of demands. It's even more than that.
Oh.
And then Serbia kind of looks to Russia to be like, "You gonna help us?" And Russia's very supportive of the Slavic people at this point.
Okay.
And they're like, "Yeah, we'll step in." And meanwhile, Austria's looking towards Germany, being like, "You got us back here," and the Kaiser's like, "I'm ready. Like, I want to fight. Just push it hard. We're gonna fight." And so basically, then Austria-Hungary does declare war on Serbia because Serbia didn't agree to all the demands in the second contract or whatever they offered them, and then Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Then Germany declares war on Russia. Then France has to declare war on Germany, and there we go.
And then because of the German offensive against France, Great Britain decides
Actually, I mean, yes. So the first offensive against France on the Western Front, known as the Schlieffen Plan.
I think it's Schlieffen.
I was listening to a podcast. And they kept calling it that. So so it's possible that guy was wrong, but was basically that the plan was that, all right, Germany doesn't want to fight war on two fronts, but they have to. They realize this, Russia and France. But they say Russia's a bit more backwater. It's going to take them a few months to actually get ready to fight.
Right.
So if we knock France out before Russia's ready, then we can just turn to the east. And it almost succeeded. But part of this plan was to go through Belgium because they didn't think that you wouldn't expect us to attack through Belgium because Belgium's neutral.
Right.
And that was the official reason Britain gave, was that you attacked a neutral nation.
Okay.
That in like 100 and some years ago, they had set up a treaty that, yes, we protect the neutral nations, and Belgium's one of them. And so they said, you broke this treaty and you attacked a neutral nation in Belgium, so we have to fight.
Okay.
But they were kind of looking for an excuse at that point anyway. But
okay. So how did the Ottoman Empire enter the war?
that was a little bit later. That was more. I'm not sure when exactly. But that was more, like I said, a bunch of advertising from both sides trying to woo any neutral sides, and I guess they chose Germany for that one.
Gotcha. And also, because Great Britain entered the war, Japan entered the war because Japan had an alliance with Great Britain. So by July of 1914, all the major European powers were at war with each other.
Yeah,
basically. And so the next major event. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I got these from this timeline from I think it's like one of the official World War I museums. They gave this timeline in late August of 1914. I think it must be the first major battle, the Battle of Tannenberg between the Germans and the Russians.
Yeah.
So the Germans defeat the Russians.
Yeah, it was like a disaster for the Russians. The Russians' whole philosophy was, we'll just send more men. Mm-hmm. We have more men than everybody. We'll just keep sending men.
Right.
And so the first two armies I think they sent, they were just completely unprepared, and they had no tactics. They marched in, and the Germans just like looped around and surrounded them, and they just marched right into a trap. And then like, shoot, we're surrounded. And so then they surrender, all of them. We're talking like 200,000 men gone.
Wow.
And then so they'd send them another army, and the same thing happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so then like for that year, the rest of the year, the Germans are basically like perfect. Like Eastern Front's like wrapped up for this year. They can't even send another army at this point. So then into the West, we got to attack France hard now.
Right. it's something, a note I wanted to make on that is Russia, in comparison with the other European nations, it is severely technologically backward.
Yeah.
They do not have nearly as advanced technology with their their weapons, their firearms, their cannons.
And when I say too that their philosophy is let's just send men.
Yeah.
There are literally times where they're sending men without weapons.
Mm-hmm.
That they're just like we can throw more people at this. Sure, we don't have guns for you, but they lost a lot of men in World War One.
Yeah, as well as the next war. But they have a huge population because of the massive land that they are in control of.
Yeah.
The many different people groups that are under their control. You have over their way to the west, way to the east. What are those people called again?
Oh, hold on.
In the east, or the region there.
The Cossacks? Or you think? I'm not sure where that is. I'm not sure.
The place where they sent exiles to die.
Oh,
basically.
Siberia?
Yeah, you have that land of Siberia, which is huge. Obviously, it doesn't have as many people there, but there's still people. There's still people there. So Russia's, in other words, Russia's huge. They have their population dwarfs all of the other European nations, except they are very backward. They are less advanced. They have not reached the industrial.
Yeah. Though I would say at this point they're trying to quickly.
Right.
Like the leaders realize that we need to increase. It's just they started way behind everybody.
Right. But that contributes to their defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg in August of 1914. The next month, September of that year. I don't know when Germany starts their.
So this is I got this one.
Okay.
So the first Battle of the Marne, known as the Miracle on the Marne. So their Schleifen plan, where the Germans are pushing west, they basically punch through Belgium, and they are.
And they have a little. The Belgians do not just give up without a fight.
No,
they offer some resistance.
Yeah, they do provide more.
This is kind of a scandal in Europe because Belgium is neutral. They're not, according to the rules of warfare at that time, because they're supposed to be civilized people who treat one another with fairness and respect. Yeah. You're not supposed to conquer a neutral nation.
Yeah.
And there's evidence of atrocities in Belgium with the soldiers mistreating the Belgians.
It was I would say that did happen. There's definitely the British. So the British have immediately put on this blockade, and so it's hard for the Germans really to get any news out off the continent.
Right. So the German naval ships are blockaded. Their trade is hindered. From the U.S.
But also
British
importantly
Navy.
is it basically gives the British a one-on-one with the United States to just keep sending them news. Mm-hmm. And so any atrocity, anything the Germans do, they're saying, see how bad they are. Like, can you believe they did this? Just because they really want the United States to enter the war.
Who's that?
The British.
Oh, okay.
And so everything they say is just slanted so hard against the Germans. And not to say that there's a lot of it is true.
Yeah.
But it's very much geared towards making the Americans want to go to war against the Germans. And so the German perspective that I read about in that was that they're like, basically, yes, we did attack some civilians, but while we were there, the civilians basically did like a guerrilla war. Like they just like a lot of civilians would just come up behind us and shoot us.
Okay.
And we lost our cool a little bit, type of thing. So that was their perspective. Anyway, back to the Battle on the Marne. So the Germans are on the offensive, and they are doing very well. They are slicing right through the northern part of France so fast that they're actually in danger of outpacing their supply line. But they know the whole goal is to take Paris really quickly. And the miracle of it, as the Allies said, because it got to the point where they expected to lose France. So they're basically on the northern part of France, where the English Channel is, and then the German army is supposed to sweep down around behind Paris. So then they've encircled
on the
Paris.
side.
Yep, and they've got it. But they got a little jumpy and came early, and they came in front of Paris.
Okay.
And so that basically allowed all of France to back up behind Paris and draw the line right there and put the fight there, and that was as far as they got.
Gotcha.
And then once they did that, they realized they weren't going to make it, and then it became what was known as the race to the sea, where they both try to flank each other to the north.
Mm-hmm.
And as they do this, this is when they start to dig in, and you just get a whole series of trenches in eastern France.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I'd also say strategically this is important that it is in France at this point, because for the next couple of years, it's the impetus is on the Allies to attack, because they're in their own homeland. The Germans now are not fighting in Germany. They can defend and just wait for the Allies to attack them.
Okay. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll continue with the Western Front, the next major battle of Ypres, or Wipers as the British called it, in October of 1914. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus, and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. We're continuing discussing the Western Front of the beginning of the Western Front of World War I. The first battle of the Marne just ended. This is where they start digging in the Western Front in their trenches. That famous trench warfare. So most people should have a general idea of what this is like. But you have armies of hundreds of thousands of men. You have tons of artillery units, tons of cannons, and so because there's so many men, and also because they can bring up resources so quickly to supply them, and they can also bring reinforcements to cover their losses so quickly. That's why it's such a stalemate.
Yeah.
In the
and
Western
it's also
Front.
the military way of thinking in 1914 when they start the war is not caught up with the technology.
Right.
There's a couple aspects of it. First of all, like they're all into like flanking maneuvers. It's hard to flank 1 million men.
Right.
The lines are like 50 miles wide.
Right.
And same thing with you have your commanders in like when we did the Civil War, the generals are right there with the army. You can see what your 30,000 men are doing and command them to do things.
Yeah.
Now there's too many men, the line's too long, you have generals back there, but this is also, at this point, they have the means of communication, but they're pretty much useless on the front line. Okay. With that many shells dropping, like to run a telegram wire, you'd get a whole bunch of people killed and they'd be destroyed in like 5 minutes. And so you have these generals sitting back there that can't see everything, that have no idea. If they send a runner, the runner's not going to come back. And so it's tough, and they're trying to do war the way they used to do it. And they're also trying to keep going on the offensive. And at this point, technology much, much favors the defense. You set up barbed wire. You've got machine guns now. The tank is not quite there. It will be by the end of the war. And so to tell people just to charge is their offensive. Right. And when there's a whole bunch of barbed wire in the way and guys with machine guns sitting up there, it's a bad plan.
Right. Especially the French. The commander of all the French armies, that was his only battle plan was we attack. We only attack. He actually literally told the soldiers, you must attack even if you die. You must not stay where you are.
And the French spirit would lead us to victory.
Yeah.
And I like and they wanted to attack in all places at all times, which was also really dumb. When they go through the Ardennes forest, they're like, but we can't take artillery with us. That's okay. You'll be lighter and faster. You'll be able to dodge the other artillery. And that didn't work out. They almost lost the war for France in days.
Right. But after the Battle of the Marne, which is, it's at least a tactical Allied victory because they halt the German offensive.
Yeah, the Germans got very far into France, but
Right.
they didn't take Paris, so that was the objective, and they failed.
At the end of October of that year, the First Battle of Ypres, I think that's how the French pronounce it, it ends in a German defeat. I don't know exactly how that goes down, but also, meanwhile, in the east, Japan, in October, captures a German-held city in China called Tsingtao. So we have to remember this is a global war. It's going on in the Pacific region as well, at least to some extent. It's also going. So eventually, the war is going to extend to Africa, the Middle East. Obviously, we see the Pacific. And then that Christmas, we have the famous Christmas truce of at least hundreds of soldiers on the Western Front on Christmas Day. They start singing carols and they decide to get out of their trenches and celebrate Christmas together before they go back to the trenches the next day and start shooting at each other.
This is like immortalized.
Right.
I would say a couple notes about it. It's only in 1914.
Right.
After another year of war, people aren't getting out of the trenches.
Right.
And also, it's mostly between the British and the Germans because the French are not going to celebrate with the Germans.
Yeah, they're right. Okay, so February of the next year, 1915, the Turkish army, or the Ottoman army, they disarm Armenian troops. So Armenia is a region in the Ottoman Empire that most of its population are Christians, or at least nominal Christians. Ottoman Empire, obviously, is a Muslim empire. It's an Islamic empire. They hate the Christians. So they disarm, because they basically rationalize it by saying the Armenians are in danger of rising up against them because they have Armenian soldiers, and so they disarm them and turn them into labor battalions, and then they forcibly remove 1 million Armenians from their homeland to the Middle East in the year 1915. This also is going to lead into the Armenian massacre of the Ottoman Empire, where millions, at least 1 million of them, are slaughtered, massacred by the Ottomans because they're Christians. Also, they are worried that they're going to help the Russians in the war, because in World War I, the Ottomans and the Russians are fighting each other. And then in 1915, also February, still, a German soldier is arrested in Maine, the state of Maine, for bombing a railroad bridge. And then Germany threatens submarine warfare against trading ships, against merchant vessels.
Oh yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about the submarine stuff. So kind of there's two different things of technology that went opposite directions. So the British had the best navy, and when the submarines came, like the idea of the submarine is presented to them, they kind of discarded it. But the Germans were like, we can use this. On the flip side, the tanks are something that the Germans saw the first ones that were rolled out, and like, these are completely useless. But the British are like, yeah, these ones are useless, but if we fix them up a bit and get them a little better, we could see their effectiveness. So the Germans didn't go for the tanks, the British didn't go for the submarines. So then the Germans, as submarine warfare is developing though, like a bit earlier than this, they had come up with an agreement, mostly fueled by the British, where a submarine was not international, that's the word. International laws was not allowed to just shoot a ship.
Right.
Because and sink it without any knowledge. So they said what a submarine has to do is it has to, basically come to the surface and say, by the way, we got you. So if you want to get off the boat, you can. And then it could shoot it. And so Germany actually started by doing this but then the British are like, wow, this is terrible. These submarines are actually pretty bad. And so they would go, okay, we surrender, and let and then the submarine would get a little closer, because then they just shoot it with guns instead of using up a very expensive torpedo. And then the British would shoot the submarine. And so once they did that, the Germans are like, well, this is really dumb. Yep. Like if we have to come to the surface and get all shot up when we could just shoot them. So then the Germans start just shoot the torpedo. Nobody has to know.
Right.
And this is again one of those things that the British showed to the Americans, and then the Lusitania is a little bit later on this year, to say like they're just shooting ships and people don't even know, and they're just getting sunk like that. And so this was a major point for the Americans, because they were sending a lot of goods over to Europe.
Right.
So they were very concerned about losing Americans and losing American ships and goods and industry to the German U-boats.
But Germany didn't care.
Actually,
they threatened. So is this a warning that they give in 1915?
So in 1915,
just letting them know you need to watch out for us.
So in 1915 they did start sinking ships.
Right.
Without, and then
that warning.
After the Lusitania, when basically the U.S. threatens to go to war and says you can't do this, the Germans are like, okay,
they concede.
Yeah, they don't do it until again 1917.
Mm-hmm, right.
They're getting more desperate.
Yeah, right.
And they're like, we got to try anything that could help us win this war. Yes, the Americans, they might push them over, but at this point we have to.
Right. Well, the next major event is April to May of 1915. The Germans used the first successful gas attack with poison gas in the Second Battle of Ypres. And this gas attack actually harms, it either kills or wounds, affects at least 10,000 Allied soldiers.
Yeah. And again, this is something that international laws had already forbidden.
Okay.
And the Germans very clearly went against that here. And obviously the British go to the Americans and say they're using gas attacks, and Americans are horrified. But then for the rest of the war, everybody uses gas attacks.
Right.
And so, yeah, the amount of people that were affected by it, I think, was over 1 million soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, by all accounts, it was just a terrible, terrible way to be attacked.
Actually, one of my ancestors now, my great grandfather, he was exposed to poison gas in World War I, and he had breathing problems after that for that rest of his life. But also in this time period of the spring of 1915, Allied forces land in Gallipoli, Turkey. Their objective is to get into the Strait of the Dardanelles in order to have access to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire,
and also be able to get resources more easily to Russia.
Right.
And so also you see a shift in tactics. At this point, the Western Front is pretty solidified as just a trench warfare. And so you see, I think there were two proposed ideas. One was to take a huge naval battle and just attack northern Germany. Mm-hmm. Winston Churchill was big on that one. Mm-hmm. But they were like, no, that could be disastrous. Mm-hmm. Instead, let's attack the Allies.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Right.
And so and when I say the
Allies are the Central Powers.
Yeah. And so they land a bunch of people in Turkey, and that goes way more poorly than they ever anticipated. Turkey puts up way more resistance, and it's basically a complete failure.
Right. Yeah. For the most part, at least. And then in May of 1915 also, a German U-boat sinks the Lusitania, as we just mentioned, a passenger ship holding more than 2,000 people, including 128 Americans. And this really biffs the Americans, because they're American lives that are lost in that. In July of this year, there's fighting in Southwest Africa in a German colony. So we have to remember, in Africa, there's fighting going on in the colonies there. In September of 1915, British and Indian troops capture a major Mesopotamian city. So that's modern-day Iraq.
Yeah. Oh, I did want to mention too, kind of more in like the Palestine area. Mm-hmm. And this is where the Ottoman Empire is in control. But you get Lawrence of Arabia, if you've ever heard of him. Mm-hmm. I think of the song.
I don't know.
No. Lawrence of Arabia, British Beatlemania. Wow, we didn't start the fire.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, so this is where he comes, and he basically becomes a heroic figure. He's basically a British officer that is charming and leading this guerrilla warfare, and he's basically found by the press because they're looking to report anything good back to home. Mm-hmm. And they go to the Western Front, and it's just like, this is bad. And there's just nothing really there, and it's a different type of warfare where your skill doesn't matter at all. Mm-hmm. You sit in a trench and you hope a shell doesn't hit you.
Right.
But here in Palestine, it's more like there's cavalry charges,
right.
and this guy Lawrence Captain Lawrence is this charming figure that's dashing and leading men, and men are gravitating to. So he becomes this big story of like, here's a hero we can look to. And now you see a similar thing with the flying aces, where it's more like your skill actually matters in this, and so you get these guys that are really lionized in the war.
But back to the Mesopotamian what's the word?
Theater?
Offensive or theater operations of the British. Now, remember, Britain held India as a colony, so they were using Indian troops in this. Their objective was to capture Baghdad, which is not where it is today, but it was nearby, about 100 miles from where it is now. They will eventually capture Baghdad, but then they have to surrender the next spring in 1916. In October of 1915, the Central Power Forces, Austria-Hungary mainly, invade Serbia with a major victory. So this is where they finally go into Serbia and they control it. Now going to the next year, February of 1916, the Battle of Verdun starts with a German artillery barrage. That's a huge battle that lasts.
We got to talk about Verdun a little bit.
Lasts for a long time.
So the casualties between the French and the Germans in Verdun were around 600,000. I mean, to put that in perspective, that is more. Well, no, I guess I think less than 600,000 men died, so a little bit different than the word casualty, in the entire Civil War from both sides.
Right.
And this is one battle we're talking about.
Yeah, we have to remember, though, it's not a one-day battle.
No,
this is like a month-long battle.
It's a few months.
Right.
And this is the German idea is basically the way the lines have worked is the French have a point sticking out and it's Verdun. And so the Germans surround them on three sides, but it's a very nationalistic site that the French are very proud of and will not give up. And so the Germans say, if we just keep attacking this and force them to just keep sending men into it, we can just be like a meat grinder for them. At this point, the idea of a war of attrition is starting. Instead of this big offensive, it's like, no, we just have to use up their men faster than our men get used up, which is a terrible thing when you think about it.
Obviously.
And so right with that, and it's probably in your notes coming up soon here, the Battle of the Somme. So this is almost entirely between the French and the Germans, and so the French appeal to the British and say, you have to attack somewhere. And so that is where the Battle of the Somme comes in, is the British try their own offensive and attack a little further north to force the Germans to also have to fight there and hopefully let up on Verdun. And the Somme is a disaster for the British. Really attacking at any point at this is a disaster. They lose. I remember, I think the first morning, like the first couple of hours of the Somme, they lost 20,000 men.
Tens of thousands of British soldiers were killed in one day.
But so the Somme is a disaster for the British.
Now the Somme is really it's the first major Allied offensive where both the French and the British are engaged.
The Verdun is, I don't know if I'd call it a victory, but it basically is a victory for the French because they don't lose Verdun.
Right.
And the amount of men they lose is similar to the Germans.
Right.
Which for them at this point is a victory in that they have the French and the British collectively, and the Russians on the other side equals more men than the Germans.
Right.
So the Germans can't afford to be trading one for one.
Right. Yep. So Verdun starts in February. That's winter of 1916. In the spring and April of 1916, the Belgians some Belgians are deported to Germany as forced laborers. So here we have an instance of German mistreatment of people. Also, an interesting point in April of 1916, Irish nationalists fight British occupation in what's called the Easter Rising in Ireland. So this is the beginning of they take advantage of the war effort. So the British obviously want as many men as possible. So they're asking Irishmen to join the army, and many of the Irish nationalists who obviously have long what's the word, deeply entrenched, rooted hatred of the British because of British oppression. They they basically rebel against the British. I don't know how it goes down, but that's an interesting thing that's happening in Great Britain in April of 1916. Then in May of 1916, anti-war demonstrations are done in several German cities. So by this point in time, there is a major anti-war
and one of the things
rising.
So with the blockade from the British, so picture, in Central Europe, you have the Germans and their allies, and they're basically surrounded by the rest of the world. The blockade was working very effectively. The lives of the people in Germany, the civilians, was rapidly declining.
Right.
To the point at the end of the war where the Americans were coming in and they had food and chocolate and stuff, and they're like, how on the outside, how good do they have it?
Yeah. There's mass starvation.
Yeah, they're starving. It's there's reason for the civilians not to really love this war anymore.
Yeah. Right, but this is 1916. We have to remember, in the spring already, the German morale is going down significantly.
And I would say at this point, everyone's morale has gone down.
Right. They are shocked by this new kind of warfare they have never experienced before, with hundreds of thousands of people dying and being wounded, being maimed. In May of 1916, Germany suspends unrestricted submarine warfare because President Wilson threatens to oppose Germany due to the sinking of a passenger ship called the Sussex. So they temporarily say, we're not going to fire merchant ships without warning anymore with our submarines. Also, in this month, the French and British claim different areas of the Middle East in a pact. So they're beginning to divide up the Middle East, which is going to is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of the war.
I would also say, as they're trying to get everybody to help them, the British particularly make promises to both the Jews and the Muslims in the area that are can't coincide.
Right.
Like they're saying to the Jews that yes, we'll make the idea of Zionism really starts. We will give you a nation back here.
Yeah. And
then, but to the Muslims, they're telling them whatever they want to hear.
Yeah.
Just to try to get every ally they can.
Right. And then also in May of 1916, the German and British navies fight for 2 days at the Battle of Jutland in Germany's attempt to stop the British blockade, resulting in almost 10,000 total casualties in a naval battle. And each side claims the victory.
Yeah.
Although it's pretty much a stalemate.
Yeah, I mean, the British say they didn't break the blockade, and the Germans say that vaunted British Navy didn't destroy us.
Yeah.
But basically that's the end of the naval war, besides the blockade and the submarine warfare, which the British the whole time were saying we are going to win the war through the Navy, and really there wasn't much Navy action.
Right. Yeah. In June of 1916, this is when the beginning of the Battle of the Somme happens in June. The first major Allied offensive. Tens of thousands of British soldiers killed in one day of the battle, although it's obviously, like you said, a few-month battle. In this battle, also, the British first used their tanks.
Yeah, which at first are very ineffective. There's not enough of them. They break down really quickly.
Right.
But they do see the potential there.
Right, and also frightens the enemy at the very least. In November of 1916, President Woodrow Wilson is reelected, and but he's running on a platform of neutrality. Their motto is, he kept us out of the war.
Yeah.
Whereas the other party is pro-war.
And the American people voted for that. It's interesting to see the buildup as it gets to, Wilson is very, very stubborn about we are not going to enter the war.
Right.
And the people back this in 1916.
Right. And then in going to the spring of 1917, the next year, skipping most of the winter, in March of 1917, the Zimmermann telegram is revealed to the U.S. It's a telegram to Mexico from Germany promising the southeastern states of Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico, if Mexico joins Germany on the occasion of the U.S. entering the war.
So I will say too about Germany and America at this point, they they're like obvious at this point. It's obvious for quite some time that if the U.S. is going to join the war, it's going to be with the Allies,
Right.
and that the U.S. at this point is completely propping up the Allies. They have virtually run out of resources, and the U.S. is just.
You mean Germany?
No, I'm talking about the Allies.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
France, Russia, England, Britain, and the U.S. is just shipping tons of resources to them, and so like at this point, the U.S. is supporting them so much so that without the U.S., the war would be over at this point, even though they're not in the war, and so the Germans are kind of looking, and they're getting desperate, and like I said earlier about the submarine warfare, they say we have to start it up again because otherwise we'll never break this blockade that's killing us. And so then they send the Zimmermann telegram, and Zimmermann was the German, like, basically
Chancellor, right?
He wasn't the one in charge.
Okay, just a diplomat.
Yeah, but he made a couple big blunders with this. So first of all, the British had already cracked the German code, but they didn't. And so the British got this and basically kept it in their back pocket till they thought it'd be a good time to tell the Americans. And then even then, people were like, "Well, that's not true. How could it possibly be true?" And then a reporter asked Zimmermann in Germany, "Is like, this isn't true, isn't it?" He's like, "Oh yeah, it is." You know, and that was one of the last straws for the American people.
Right. Then in April, the next month, the American steamer the Aztec is sunk by a German U-boat, and it causes the drowning of 28 Americans. And that month, the U.S. declares war on Germany. This is the spark, that sinking. They would declare war on Germany after Wilson persuades Congress.
Yeah. And I would say persuade is a strong word there, because he basically said, all right, put it up to vote to Congress that we can go to war. And it was like, in the Senate, it was like 93-7 or something like that. It was overwhelming that the U.S. was going in.
Right. And then also in April of 1917, the Germans smuggle Vladimir Lenin into Russia from a Swiss exile so that he can stir up Russian workers to strike.
That worked out well for them.
which began soon the Russian Revolution, which led to Russia backing out of the war. In April to May of 1917, there were mass mutinies in the French army. Like you said, their resources were running low, in which about 22,000 French soldiers refused to attack.
This was a spot in the war where, had the Germans had the intelligence that the French were doing this, they could have probably won the war right there with an offensive. But they didn't, and the French managed to kind of hold things together. But you do see the French, by the end of the World War I, the French army, the French morale was utterly shattered.
Right.
And you see this kind of extended to World War II. When the Germans first attack, they make terrible decisions. They seem not at all ready for war.
Right. And then in June of that year, 1917, the first American troops land in France under the command of General John Pershing. Then the next month, July, the third Battle of Ypres begins, lasting till November. So in this war, you have battles that are the third time they're fighting at
and so this is
place.
just, think of the trench warfare. They're not moving.
Right.
So they're just all fighting in the same spots.
Right. The only gains they have is like a mile or a couple
and
miles.
a lot of times they're just switching trenches with each other.
Right. In November of 1917, the Balfour Declaration is presented in London to the people, expressing British support of a Jewish nation in Palestine, like you said, the rise of Zionism. Also in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks, which literally means the majority, they take over the Russian government and demand a peace with the Central Powers after 2 months of violent revolution, and soon they will break off from the war, making a treaty with Germany and so on.
Yeah. At which point, when they demand a treaty, Germany gives them horrible terms.
Right.
But they want out of the war so badly they just accept it. And then this also allows Germany to say, all right, everything to the Western Front.
Yeah.
It's basically a last race to the end to see who can last out the longest.
Yep. Then December of 1917, the British captured Jerusalem, resulting in British celebration. So now we have the first major gain for them to start sending Jews to Jerusalem after the war. In March of 1918, the spring of 1918, a peace treaty, like you said, between Russia and Germany is signed, Russia agrees to give up a third of its population to farmland, half of its industry, and almost all of its coal mines.
This is important because remember Germany's in blockade and has no resources.
Yep. And then in July, the summer of 1918, the first major offensive, including Americans, is launched, resulting in Allied victory.
I will say before that. So as the Germans came from the east and they put everything to the west, basically they made a calculated risk, I guess, and that they're like we're gonna, like, the Americans are coming. The Americans are in the war, but they aren't really mobilized at this point, and we need to win now. And we if the Americans get here, we've lost anyway. So they go on an offensive. We're just a desperate offensive. If we can take Paris again, and drop France, we might have a shot. And so they just send everything they've got into this offensive. I think they lose 800,000 men in like a month. And as they do get in sight of Paris, but they've so overextended themselves, and the Americans start to filter in, and then pretty much the rest of the way, it's just the Allied offensive just marches through them at this point.
Right. So that's July of 1918. In October, the fall of 1918, Germany requests an armistice from President Wilson.
Oh, I may say too, so tanks are now a big thing.
Right.
Where they are now able to just roll right through barbed wire, roll right through the trenches.
And craters.
And the infantry can follow the tanks instead of going first.
Right. Yep, so you have the major tank warfare, which is a huge help to the Allies. But in October of 1918, Germany requests an armistice from Wilson under Germany's terms through the German Chancellor, who sends a request, I think, through some Swiss people. But Wilson refuses those terms of the armistice in October of 1918. Also in October of 1918, Austria separates from Hungary, with the Czechs declaring themselves independent after seizing Prague. So you have the breakup of the Austria-Hungary Empire. Then in November of 1918, finally, Kaiser Wilhelm II gives up his throne. The word is abdicate, and flees to Holland.
I would say, too, so Armistice Day is November 11th. This is 1 week before that. So it's like a hastily constructed government of Germany that signs the armistice, which actually becomes a problem going forward.
We'll call it the German Republic.
In that the people, a lot of the German people are like, see, we never really surrendered. This German Republic that took over betrayed us.
Gotcha.
Is the narrative. Even like they had obviously lost the war, but that's what they told themselves going forward into World War II.
Okay. And then the Austrian Emperor abdicates his throne, along with Austria accepting truce terms from the Allies. Finally, in November 11th, which we get Veterans Day in the U.S. from, Germany signs an armistice with severe terms.
Actually, a little addendum to that too, I'd say, is the armistice. So the Allies had thought through kind of what they wanted to say to Germany, and when Germany says, like, we're done, the Allies say, we don't have truce terms yet, just go home and we'll do a peace treaty later.
Okay.
Which is very strategic in that if you get their army off the field and you've beaten them, once you get to the peace terms, they have no negotiating power. Because they don't have much of an army to get back on the field. They can't you can't remobilize at that point. They know they've lost.
Well, actually, speaking to that, the Allies actually enter into Germany. The Allied
they
forces,
do. They cross the Hindenburg Line.
Yeah.
But, and this was an interesting debate. I was listening to someone that there were a number of people who thought that they should have kept going, even when, in that basically. They stopped. They didn't go all the way to Berlin. Is that on the argument that the German people didn't realize they were beaten, and so leading to World War II, where they say, we were never really conquered.
Gotcha.
Type like that. That's the narrative that Hitler
narrative,
tries
right.
to, and a lot of the German people are very ambitious and follow that, obviously.
Although from what I have read in World War II, that we'll probably get to event at some point. Many of the German people, even in 1939, were not in favor of starting a war.
I can believe. I know. Like, so Hitler, it's kind of a separate thing here. But you know how.
Speaking of Hitler, we should mention that Hitler was a World War I soldier. He fought in the German army.
Yeah. But so, a lot of people will say, like, what about the two-party system is so wrong? And I'm not saying the two-party system is great, but Germany at the time leading up to World War II had several parties, like some people say. And you see there the problem with several parties is that Hitler won all that power with like 35% of the vote because he had the biggest share. And so just that's one of the problems with having several different parties.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can get back to the end of World War I, though.
Right. So the armistice is basically a cessation of warfare. It's not an official peace treaty giving all the terms. But that's November 11th. The guns fall silent. The German forces are allowed to go home. Also, a notable thing in November of 1918, in the African state of Rhodesia, there has been a German colonial resistance against Allied forces led by a famous German colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck, who surrenders his guerrilla forces. Apparently, according to military historians, he is one of the greatest military leaders of history, and I've never heard of him until
I heard a little bit
yesterday.
I think basically he has this small little outpost in Africa.
Yeah.
With, I think they said maybe like 2,000 men, no reinforcements.
I read 5,000.
Okay. Mine sounds better. No, I'm just kidding.
It does.
But so, and like, no reinforcements coming, and the Allies are encroaching, and he holds out for years.
Just through guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, and so that part, without knowing many more details than that, like, that's impressive.
Right. So the conclusions of the war. In December of 1918, Yugoslavia declares itself an independent state. It's inhabited by Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. It actually does not have the name Yugoslavia until the 20s, though. In June of the next year, 1919, Germany and Allies signed the Peace Treaty of Versailles. I believe that's in France, a city in France. The Chinese are actually involved because I believe they were fighting against the Japanese. Their delegates actually refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles because the terms of the treaty forced them to hand over resources to Japan. Then in July, finally, the German Republic ratifies the treaty, causing them to give up the highly disputed land of Alsace-Lorraine, which is a
couple provinces right on the border between France and Germany that they kept swapping for the last couple hundred years.
Right. That goes to France. They are forced to recognize Belgian sovereignty, that Belgium is a sovereign nation. They are forced to disarm their military, to not have a standing military. And they also have to pay war reparations. So basically the Allies blame Germany as being the major instigator of the war.
And I forget the exact total for the war reparations. I remember like 5 to 10 years ago when they finally finished paying them off.
Yeah.
And it was an insane amount. But part of that was, and this is another result of the war, so in that America basically became a superpower.
Right.
And part of this was all the industry that went towards it. And another part was all the debt that America backed, that people had to pay back. So all the Allies, like France and Russia, used up all their credit to the point where America wouldn't lend to them anymore. So then Britain used their credit to buy for France and Russia. And we're talking, I think it was $9.5 billion, which in 1917 is insane.
Right.
And to the point where America, when America went into the war, I think it was 2 weeks later that Britain reached their credit limit. Like, to the point where no more, and financially speaking, Britain, France, and Russia were broke at that point, and it was all America at this point. But then, of course, after the war, America's like, and you do have to pay us back.
Right.
And we became very, you have the Great Depression coming up, but in a sense, we became very wealthy with all the other nations relying on us, and we were certainly, arguably, the superpower at that point.
Yep. So the U.S. Congress actually refuses to agree to the Treaty of Versailles, since it establishes the League of Nations, which is an effort to unite the German nations so that war will be prevented. In November 1919, I don't know. They're basically isolationists. They don't want to get involved in another European conflict until they're forced to.
Yeah.
In World War II. Then the Treaty of Sèvres, or Sèvres, is signed between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. This divides the Middle East into British-ruled Palestine and Iraq, French-ruled Syria and Lebanon, and the independent kingdom of Hejaz, which is later to be Saudi Arabia. So here you have the beginning of the horrible tensions and conflicts in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, with all these nations being divided among the European powers. The death toll of World War One: 8.5 million soldiers, 8,500,000 soldiers are killed, and 13 million civilians die during the war, during the entire war. So you have to remember, it's not just the Western Front; it's also the Eastern Front, which involves millions of soldiers, millions of civilians as well.
Yeah.
With Russia, the Ottoman Empire, also in Africa. Italy, we didn't mention Italy. Italy is eventually involved in the war, but they have a very small part in it. They're on the Allied side. Yeah. Then, like we said, 4 imperial monarchies end: the Habsburg monarchy, the Hohenzollerns, the German monarchy, the Ottoman Sultanate, the Islamic rulership of the Ottoman Empire, and the Romanov line of rulers in Russia. They end. It also results in the Spanish flu, which begins, I think it
started in 1918.
Yeah, in the United States. Eventually, the Spanish flu, in the third wave of it, in the spring of 1919, 21 to 25 million people in Europe are killed by the Spanish flu. You look, that's more than the civilians that died during the war. Spanish flu. And then as far as like ideologies that rise out of World War One, in terms of Christian thought, neo-orthodoxy actually starts to be popularized. That's a new form of liberal Christianity that basically says the Bible is myth and it's not really literally historically true. It just teaches spiritual truths that can be interpreted in highly, really, frankly, stupid ways. Then you have, obviously, communism rises. You have the Soviet Union that begins in 1917. Communism is on the rise. Socialism takes root in Germany.
Yep.
That's actually, the Nazis are the Nationalist Socialist Party.
Yep.
Then you also have the rise of Zionism, with the move of those who want to bring Jews into Israel to found a Holy Land. And then also, in that vein, in terms of Christianity, dispensationalism. In terms of Christian thought, postmillennialism, the view that Christ will come after a thousand-year reign on earth of Christians, and then Christ will come in order to like crown that or consummate that rule. So basically the whole world will become Christian, and then Christ will come. That's postmillennialism. This view is basically, because of the war, because we've shown that we like to kill ourselves so much, that's out of the picture. We're not going to have a utopia.
Yeah.
We're still. In fact, so the thought is that humans are not getting progressively better. We're actually getting progressively worse because we were so willing to fight this war that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. So it heightens the Christian view of pessimism, that things are getting worse and worse and worse until Christ comes, and the world will not become increasingly Christian but increasingly pagan. In other words, the rise of prophecy. Looking at prophecy, a lot of Christians viewed World War I as part of the apocalypse, as part of the those end time of events that go on. Some influential men that were involved in the war, we've already noted a couple of them. Adolf Hitler, he was a soldier in the war. He's a failed art student, and he eventually obviously becomes a major charismatic political figure. General, is it Isaac Eisenhower? Dwight, thank you. Eisenhower, who will become a major general in World War II. He fights in World War I as an American soldier. Also, Mussolini is an Italian soldier in World War I. Some notable theologians that actually are involved in World War I. J. Gresham Machen. He is an American theologian and professor at Princeton University. He actually volunteers for the Red Cross during World War One. John Murray is a professor at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He is a British soldier in World War One. Also, the famous author J.R.R. Tolkien. He fights as a World War One soldier. Yeah. And in World War One, he obviously famously authors the Lord of the Rings.
I think C.S. Lewis was in the war too.
Okay, I don't remember that. Winston Churchill was a leader in the war as well.
Yep.
I forgot exactly what role
he was in charge of the Navy.
Okay, yep.
For the British. I would also say another kind of movement as far as the writing and the arts and stuff was the Lost Generation. And you get this whole sense too of the PTSD coming out of it, of the young men and not even knowing what life's about anymore.
Right.
You get like Hemingway is one of them.
Oh yeah.
I feel like F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yep.
Coming at them with this kind of hopeless perspective, and that's kind of a lot of the feeling of this generation. I also heard something interesting about how with the women, the role of women expanded. As all the men were going off to war, and then the men coming back, a lot of them still in shell shock.
Yeah.
That this really, in general, promoted the roles of women and, in a sense, kind of emasculated men as far as what the typical roles were and what the men were supposed to be doing.
And also masculinated women.
Yeah.
If that you can use that term.
Yeah, I think we can.
You see a major rise in feminism in the 20s. With what are those people called in the jazz age?
Hold on, it's not the Flappers?
Yes, the Flappers.
Okay.
The Flappers. You have a major feminist movement that rises.
And not only the U.S. but several other places, the women get the right to vote.
Right.
Very shortly after the war. So I've got a couple things that a couple points here was just I kind of mentioned it about counting the cost before doing major things. Let's see. Another one was about. So this was a common saying, and I think it was popularized later. But the idea that lions, in World War I, that there were lions led by donkeys, that the men in the trenches actually fighting were led by these men in the back that didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
And so just if you are a leader, to lead among the men, and not just send men into unknowns.
Right.
I think that those are a couple things I think I wanted to say.
On that point, I wanted to note the role of chaplains in World War One. This is actually the first major war where there's really an official role for chaplains in the European armies. And they play a major role. There's a few famous British chaplains. One of them named Theodore Hardy. He was awarded 2 British service medals for his. So these are non-combatants. Except for the French, all the chaplains in the European armies did not actually fight, but they would help with the wounded. They would pray. They would pray with them. They would obviously preach to them if they were truly, actually biblical chaplains.
Yeah, I did hear one thing on the chaplains that when being trained, I forget who it was that was training them this way. It would be basically like, all right, I have 3 minutes left to live. Give me the gospel so that I'll believe it. And the idea being that if a person had to be able to share the gospel very quickly,
right?
Because say if somebody's lying on the battlefield and is about to die, and that was at least the one guy training him, that was his training method.
Right. Also, a note on Christianity in World War One. Many of the British churches, just like in the Civil War, we saw in the Civil War, they held days of prayer for the soldiers, especially since they had a national church, the Anglican Church, which was backing
the war effort.
The war. Now, after the war, obviously, you have the rise of nihilism, like you said, the rise of atheism, the rise of more humanism, liberal Protestantism, social gospel. But you also have evangelistic efforts that are promoted to reach those soldiers that fought in the war, that have no hope, and now the only hope they can turn to is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And you do get, kind of on a bigger national scale, you start to see things like ideas for national health care, in that like all these soldier like national pensions. Like what about the widow that her husband died in the war? So you start to see more of these social ideas come into play after the war as a result.
Right. Well, I think one major lesson we can learn from the war is that it's a horrible, grim reality that we have. The hatred of the human heart is such they will go to great lengths to destroy one another. And yet, in the midst of darkness like that, the light of the gospel can shine and people can be saved. And also, out of that hopelessness, you have an opportunity to proclaim the gospel. And people in our age, in our generation, there are a lot of people like that. We're not in a war, obviously, but we're in a war for our souls and our sanity, with the fact that we live in such decadent societies that are obsessed with entertainment and just the pleasures of this earth, that there's an emptiness there that can only be filled by the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think that the Lord used this to promote the gospel, as he uses everything. And I think we can do the same in our day and age, especially just hopelessness. The view that there's no point in life, in living. There's a meaninglessness to the universe, to our existence. People are looking for true meaning and true purpose and the hope of eternal life. Death is coming. People try to put it off, but you must have eternal life if you are to be saved from the wrath to come. So Jesus Christ is the answer. Turn to him and live. Thank you for listening to this edition of the King's Hand in History podcast. We'll be back to you soon to give you another look at the King's Hand in history. Until next time, please continue to look for his hand in history and in your life, and God bless.